source of instant cash because whale oil was greatly in demand. Whale oil is the best oil there is for lighting. So the first spurt to acquisition of capital in Australia was whale oil. It wasn't until about 1810 that Australia starts to become significant as a pastoral country, and not for a lot longer that it becomes important as an agricultural country. In fact, Australia's agricultural wealth, Australia as an exporter of grain, really begins in the railway age. But as an exporter of wool, from about 1810 Australia is starting to export wool and becoming a valuable possession. The first governor, Governor Phillip, said that although the beginnings of the colony didn't look all that fabulous, with a bunch of convicts, etc., and a fairly degenerate bunch of women who were mostly prostitutes, he predicted that it would become one of the most valuable possessions of the British Crown. And indeed, so it became. And it happened rather earlier than even he would have expected. By 1810, New South Wales is producing money. Once it started to producing money, of course, the younger children of aristocrats or lesser gentry, or gentry who wanted to come out, who didn't have enough money to be really wealthy in England, didn't have enough land to be really wealthy in England, saw coming to Australia and getting a land grab as a possibility. And this creates the first Australian semi-aristocracy, the landowners. So there were squatters and gentlemen in early Australia. And they're coming from about 1820 on. Respectable people. Because it was a good place to make money. I should define this term squatters. From about 1830 on, New South Wales was divided into a settled region called the 19 counties. It stretched along the New South Wales coast, basically from down near the Victorian border up to near Port Macquarie, and inland about as far west as Wellington or Dubbo. And this area was where land grants were made and where the government could provide the rudimentary services of government, which basically meant a police magistrate. Government wasn't in the business of providing education yet, but it did provide a police magistrate. It could provide law and order. Now, beyond that, the government's only duty, as it saw it, was to protect Aborigines and to stop open warfare between white settlers and Aborigines. However, into that land beyond there, which was owned by the Crown in point of law, although given to Aborigines for their use, there developed a struggle for land between the Aborigines and the so-called squatters. Now, the squatters were not the kind of people with whom we associate the word squatters today. We associate squatters with rather scruffy people who live in buildings which are abandoned, often with no water, etc. These squatters were wealthy people who bought sheep and went out into the land beyond the 19 counties, beyond the limits of settlement, as it was called, occupied this land, which the government had said was for the use of Aborigines at that time, and kept their sheep there. Now, the government had no chance of stopping them, so it started licensing them. So they would have to pay a license fee to occupy this land. And the government then started sending out magistrates who would normally combine the title of magistrate and protector of Aborigines to mediate in the conflicts between Aborigines and squatters over all this. I'm not going to talk about that in a great deal of detail. But so the squatters in an Australian context are big landholders, not big landowners. They don't own any land, but they certainly hold land. And from the time the licence system is introduced, which is 1835, they hold it legally. A good example of gentlemen farmers is the Henty family, who set up Portland in Victoria as squatters, and still an influential family in that part of Victoria. Now, by the time we get to the 1830s, Australia is making money. There's opposition to more convicts coming because the descendants of convicts are making good, and suddenly they start to see convicts as immoral. It's a paradox, isn't it? Leaving their parents behind. They don't want more convicts coming into their country. There's also pressure for democratic institutions, or at least representative institutions, as we'll see when we talk about that next week. Increasingly, people who live in Australia are trying to encourage free migrants to come. Australia is never as popular a destination for migrants as the United States or Canada. It's a lot further, etc. But there is increasing interest in migration. The advocates of migration, two of them are very important, and their names are mentioned quite a lot. One is Carolyn Chisholm, and the other is John Dunmore Lang. Sectarianism was really big in Australia at this time. It represented the division between Catholic and Protestant, and the division between English and Irish. Carolyn Chisholm was an English Catholic woman, not an Irish Catholic woman, and she encouraged the migration of young Catholic girls. John Dunmore Lang was a Scottish Presbyterian, and he encouraged the migration of Protestant families, family units. Chisholm and Lang were great enemies. Lang accused Chisholm of trying to Romanise Australia through the thoroughly Jesuitical device of the mixed marriage, where a single Protestant man would marry a Catholic woman and the children would be brought up as Catholics. Carolyn Chisholm saw that there was a big problem with the imbalance of the sexes in Australia, so that Australia then had the sort of reputation which New Zealand has today. You know, men are men and sheep are afraid, etc. And the outback of Australia, where there were lots of single shepherds, there weren't too many fences at this time, was a place which needed taming and needed civilising. And she believed that no one civilised and tamed men like good women. And she famously said that women could be God's police in Australia. A very famous line. Anne Summers, who's had a very important career in Australian politics and culture, wrote a book way back in the 70s called Damned Whores and God's Police, which are two images. Ralph Clark, Lieutenant Ralph Clark, described the first women who arrived in Australia as a bunch of damned whores. And of course Carolyn Chisholm described women as God's police. Very influential book, that. Well, I'm only going to look at the respectable side of it in this. This is a family lecture, family-friendly lecture. I'm looking at the God's police side of women's role here. So she saw women as God's police. By encouraging marriage, bringing out single girls, the wild men of the Australian bush could be tamed. And largely it worked. But there was this sectarian bitterness between Lang and Chisholm, which is important. I'm going to show you some statistics, just to give you some idea of... these are some convict-era migration statistics. First of all, this shows you population pressure. You can see the rapid growth of population in England in the second half of the 18th century. It goes up by about a half, about 50% increase in 50 years, compared with hardly any increase in the previous 50 years. Now that's partly a sign of affluence. Population grows when things are affluent. It's a mistake to see the 18th century in the era of industrialisation as unbridled poverty. England, in fact, is taking off to become the richest country in the world and the first industrial nation and all that sort of thing. But social dislocation happens with it, and slums. And in Ireland too, we've got an enormous increase in population. And the population of Great Britain as a whole increases by over 50% in this half century. Here's the convict population of New South Wales. You can see the imbalance of the sexes. This is the convict population. As late as 1836, there are 25,000 male convicts and only 2,500 females. and convicts are 31% of the population. In Tasmania, there are